with these forest fires, so they release combustion products. So when the wood burns, it releases particles into the air. And this stuff is in the air all the time. It's just usually at fairly low concentrations. And so when it gets to really high concentrations, such as when you have one of these widespread forest fires that's involving a huge amount of territory, then it starts to, it accumulates to high concentrations in the air, and it gives that haze, that sort of smoky appearance. And I think, one of the issues we're dealing with currently is sort of the weather pattern in this area, or the Northeast, is sort of funneling that stuff around and kind of sending it down our way instead of letting it blow out into the North Atlantic Ocean. And that's partly why we're seeing these issues. So the stuff's there all the time, but it's usually at much lower concentrations and not enough to really cause this visible smoke and haze and even the smell. Sometimes I saw in the news this morning that the Yankee Stadium, the ball game last night, actually smelled like a campfire because there was so much of this smoke and particulate matter, combustion products in the air.
Gotcha. So when you see smoke and haze in this level of concentration, what is the first thing that you think of? Is there a concern when you see this much concentration?
Yeah, so we worry about it certainly for our patients with respiratory disease. So our asthma patients, especially, COPD to a lesser extent. But asthma patients, one of the hallmarks of asthma is something called bronchial hyperreactivity. And in essence, bronchial hyperreactivity is sensitive or twitchy airways. So in the same way that some patients with eczema, for instance, have sensitive skin, patients with asthma have sensitive airways. And smoke, particulate matter, combustion products in the air is one of those very common irritants that aggravates the airways of patients with asthma. And so what we're seeing in our asthma patients is increased symptoms: coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness, things of that nature. And that's why you see the alerts for patients with lung disease to minimize time outside, to minimize exposure to some of these triggers. We also see it in our ordinary allergy patients as well. So smoke, particulate matter, things like that can affect the eyes. It can affect the nose. It's not a typical allergen in the strict sense of the word that we think of as allergists, immunologists, but it is really more of an irritant. But it can cause very similar symptoms. So itchy, watery, red, burning eyes, headaches, nasal congestion, runny nose, sneezing, kind of a burny, irritated sensation to the nose. And that same stuff is happening down in the airways of our patients with asthma and the respiratory diseases.
Gotcha. So with what's going on in some of the more northern states, have we seen any of that start to make it towards us here in Virginia?
Yeah, I think we've seen on sort of the maps of air quality, there are certainly warnings that it is headed or it's made it down our way. I know some of the northern North Carolina counties have a warning today. Thankfully, I think the rain that we've had today has kind of helped wash some of that out of the air. That's why our immediate central south side, Southwest Virginia area is not under a warning, but it is a good advice for patients with lung disease to minimize time outdoors on days like this, and to follow air quality reports through local media outlets, and minimize time outdoors on those unhealthy days.
Gotcha. Now, is this something that you expect to be ongoing for a few more days or even weeks, or is this something that's more in the short term?
Yeah, so I would ask George, Sydney, and Will about that, because it's mainly dependent on the weather, and we see this every now and then. Sometimes, depending on the prevailing winds and the weather patterns, if there are wildfires in California or Texas or even Mexico, sometimes we'll see the effects of that here. It's usually fairly short-lived, and the winds come through and sort of blow all that stuff out to sea. So it shouldn't be more than, I think, a few days, but I'll let the weather experts weigh in on that.
Okay, awesome. Well, Charles, is there anything that we didn't cover today that you think would be important to know?
No, I think we touched on the importance of, one other thing I would add, things that people can do to sort of minimize the effects of this. Certainly spend time indoors, especially if you have any sort of lung or cardiovascular disease. If you are going to be outside, try to exercise indoors on these days. Don't exercise, outdoors. If you do have to be outdoors, wear a mask. So an N95 or a respirator type mask can help filter out some of these particles. A surgical mask is not that great. Surgical mask is better for respiratory droplets like the flu, cold virus, things like that. It is not fine enough to filter out some of these very fine particulate matter that's in the air from the fires.